A secret history of sexuality on the front. It was a hot night in Borneo and 8 Australian soldiers were sitting around discussing film stars they fancied. The war had just ended. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ashes, but most soldiers in Asia remained on active duty in the all-male environments they'd become accustomed to. One boy said June Allison was his favorite, another liked Susan Hayward, and a third dreamt of Betty Grable. When someone spoke about Marlene Dietrich, things got steamy. One of the horny soldiers writes Roderick Anderson in his memoir Free Radical, said how much he wanted sex. But when someone put on a sissy voice and said, "I didn't know you scared," the sexual potential of the situation became explicit, so nothing more was said. A few days after this incident, however, those same 8 soldiers were drunk on jungle juice. Anderson writes that the lights were blown out. They groped each other, paired off and disappeared into the night. Afterwards, an unspoken conspiracy of silence buried the matter. No one discussed whether they were making do or whether it was a more permanent orientation. Back in those days when gay meant happily carefree, the idea of a distinct homosexual identity was in its infancy. Homosexuality was illegal in Australia and in the defense forces. Homosexual acts were punishable by life imprisonment. The heterosexual-homosexual divide we take for granted today was a relatively new concept. The very term homosexual only emerged towards the end of 19th century. Official silence, a veil of secrecy, and even outright disbelief among wartime sex among servicemen has reigned supreme ever since, compounded by mythologies about Aussie diggers and the mateship legend. Now historians are telling a different, more realistic story thanks to the release of an army filed on the discharge of male homosexuals in WW2. During investigations over the past 2 years, researchers Yorick Sman and Graham Willett gained almost complete access to the National Archives file, first released in 1992 but in a heavily edited form that revealed little. One of the key episodes outlined in the fuller file is about a series of incidents in New Guinea in late 1943 involving a group of self-identifying homosexual or camp KAMP men. The records include the life stories of 18 of these soldiers who were interviewed by a major after they were reported for illicit sex by a United States defense investigator. The soldiers' names and identifying material have been withheld, but the file details how Army authorities for the first time began to tackle the idea that there was a difference between homosexual behavior and homosexual identity. Dr. Willett, a senior lecturer at the University of Melbourne's Australian Centre, suspects that the men agreed to tell their stories in detail in exchange for medical discharge rather than a dishonorable one. The historians, whose research was partly funded by the Australian Army History Unit, say they had long suspected homosexuality in the armed services was far more common than traditionally acknowledged. They initially pieced together fractured accounts from novels, diaries, memoirs, oral histories, and official records. The accounts include situational sex between men, making do because there were no women around, so that butch men might have sex with queens with no loss to their masculine status. This is possibly the case with some of the 1945 jungle Jews soldiers in Borneo. Other incidents the researchers came across involved a more clearly articulated homosexual identity. The stories in the National Archives file, however, are different to those other sources. They not only give extraordinary insight into the lives of homosexual men on the front line, but also detail their first sexual experiences, relationships and friendships, sex lives, army experiences, and their relationships with each other and the American soldiers stationed nearby. The filed and other New Guinea research material reveals such things as wild sex parties in the jungle, regular sexual horseplay, and liaisons with American soldiers in old shower blocks. Sex was certainly central to their wartime experience, and the Americans were particularly prized, says Dr. Smart of those 18 soldiers, an historian from Griffith University. His PhD on sexuality in WW2 sparked his research with Dr. Willett. Traits were often found at the bar at the American Red Cross at Ella Beach, where a large camped crowd hung about. Some Americans would often take half a dozen Australian girls, as they were known, out to the bush by jeep or truck where sex would take place. There were only about 15 US men to 6 girls at these parties, and it was common for the Australians to have more than one partner at a night to keep the men satisfied. Dr. Smart says the role-playing of the girls in New Guinea was shaped by commonly held notions of the day about sexuality and gender. They were, in the words of the US Army provost, who alerted Australian officials, men who practiced the female side of homosexuality. In one excerpt from the Army files, a soldier recounts how he would go about with other camped men, visiting the American Red Cross at Ella Beach. Several times we were picked up by Australian or American soldiers. Once or twice we went along the beach. Other times we went in parties in trucks into the bush. We had relations with them. Others spoke of how aunties took less experienced men under their wings and taught them the tricks of the trade. The jungle sex parties were discovered by the US Army provost in what Dr. Smart describes as a witch hunt. The American Army has certainly got a pedigree with that sort of activity. He says the provost had worked with a vice squad, so he knew what he was looking for, the signs and codes of the perverted practices he was seeking out. As one soldier reports in the files, after first joining the army and having sex with 8 or 9 other soldiers in his unit, he ran about a lot, enjoying many sexual adventures. But 5 weeks before giving his statement, he had met an Australian at the American Red Cross. I am greatly in love with him. He returns my love and he asked me to live with him in later life. This I have promised to do.